If you like learning about the obscure history of the NFL on Jaguar Gator 9, then you're really going to like what's taking place on the all-new channel Jaguar Gator 8, where we talk all things college football. Click the card in the upper right corner to subscribe to that channel. And now, on with our feature presentation. You ever get a game in your market and think to yourself, why the heck are we getting this game? There's a much better and much more relevant game going on, and we're stuck with this game? Maybe that's not the case as much today, since we have streaming and Sunday Ticket and other ways to watch an out-of-market game. But back in 1990, before we had any of those things, I'm sure that sentiment was felt by a ton of people on a weekly basis. And there were some pretty egregious examples, with one of them being a bizarre controversy from 1983 involving the coverage of a Miami Dolphins game down in Tampa Bay, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But at least with that one, the decision was entirely out of NBC's control, and the right move was made in the end. The one we're talking about today, on the other hand, holy cow, this was bad. This was a decision that was entirely under control by CBS, and where they royally messed up at the end of the day by giving into an incredibly vocal but small minority, even though all the evidence regarding the silent majority suggested otherwise. In 1990, KMOV, the CBS affiliate in St. Louis, made an absolutely baffling decision regarding what game they were going to air, that more than 3 decades later, I'm still not sure I understand what the heck they were thinking, because everything about this move was so stupid that it defies all the principles of logical reasoning. And this is the story behind one of the dumbest broadcasting decisions in CBS history. Before I talk about the controversy in question, we need some context to understand the market, what potential games CBS had at their disposal, and what led them to make this baffling decision. For 28 seasons, the Cardinals played their games in St. Louis, playing their games at either Sportsman Park or Busch Stadium every year from 1960 to 87. Now, the Cardinals were rarely good. They only made it to the playoffs 3 times, only won their division twice, and never won a playoff game. As a side note, if you want to learn more about their last playoff game in St. Louis, which was their 1982 first-round game against the Green Bay Packers, click the card in the upper right corner. After the 1987 season, the Cardinals packed their bags and moved to Arizona, which was becoming a hot market, as even the Eagles were considering moving down there at one point during the 80s. Just like that, there was no more football in St. Louis. However, even though the St. Louis Cardinals were now the Phoenix Cardinals, the CBS affiliate in St. Louis, KMOV, continued to show Cards games. Keep in mind that KMOV was under no contractual obligation to show the Cardinals, and they were not required by the NFL to show the Cardinals. St. Louis did not have an NFL team, and they were not the secondary market of any team, so St. Louis was, for lack of a better term, a free agent city, and could pick whatever game it wanted to on a weekly basis. This is part of the reason why some football fans in Los Angeles were upset when the Rams and the Chargers moved, because instead of getting the best game on a weekly basis, they were now contractually obligated to show those teams. However, KMOV showed the Cardinals, and the ratings were incredibly strong. Whether people were hate watching the Cardinals, or whether they still loved their team even though they were 1,500 miles away in the desert, KMOV had a ratings hit on their hand with Phoenix Cardinals games. When you look at the numbers, it's no surprise that the first 40 Cardinals games after they left St. Louis were televised in the city. In every sense of the word, the Cardinals were still the most popular team in town. Over the first 9 weeks of the season, their games drew an average Nielsen rating of 11. The overall average for NFL games shown in the market was 7.7, so the Cardinals were significantly raising the average. When the Cardinals were the only game in their time slot and were completely unopposed, meaning that there were no games taking place on NBC at the time, their average rating was a 14.2, with other NFL teams playing unopposed games drawing a 12.6 rating. And one of their games in Week 8, which was Phoenix's 31-21 loss to the Chicago Bears, drew an incredible 14.8 rating and a 32 share, meaning that roughly 1/3 of the people watching TV in St. Louis at the time were watching that game. Now, some might argue that the Cardinals only had these high ratings because they were unopposed, and that if fans had the option to watch other games, they would have. Well, from Week 1 through Week 3, the Cardinals played at noon in the Central Time Zone on CBS, and went directly against the noon game on NBC. The average TV rating for the NBC game was a 5.8, with the average TV share being a 15.3. The average TV rating for the Cardinals on CBS? That was a 9.6, with the average TV share being a 24.7. So that argument goes out the window, since the Cards were practically doubling any competing games. The Cardinals were still a ratings winner in St. Louis, even though they left the city 3 years before. CBS had a winning formula on their hands. But not everyone was happy, and the vocal minority was about to make their opinions known. As you can probably expect whenever a team leaves a city, not everyone is willing to support the team of their new location. Not everyone is just going to accept the fact that they were leaving, especially after that team was there for 3 decades and gave the city absolutely nothing from a success standpoint. Don't get me wrong, the Cardinals were still the most popular team in St. Louis, as clearly evidenced by their ratings victories on a seemingly weekly basis. But there was a vocal minority that wanted nothing to do with the Cardinals, and did not want to watch a single game involving the Big Red the moment that they left St. Louis behind. One fan by the name of Christopher Lunning was furious that on October 14th during Week 6, instead of St. Louis getting the chance to watch New York play Washington in the marquee 3 o'clock game for supremacy in the NFC East, and in a close and competitive game where the Giants ultimately prevailed 24-20, that they were stuck watching the blowout and significantly less attractive game between the Dallas Cowboys and the Phoenix Cardinals, which the Cardinals won 20-3. As Lunning bluntly said to KMOV, "Give the real football fans a break and drop the Big Red coverage." What a joke. Again, this was not the majority viewpoint, as this was an extremely vocal minority. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in a completely unaffiliated market, and CBS has the option to show 2 games. One of them is Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs taking on Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals in a rematch of the AFC Championship. The other one is the Jacksonville Jaguars taking on the Houston Texans. If CBS decides to show the Chiefs-Bengals game, you're not writing a letter, sending off an email, or flooding the phone lines telling them that they made the right decision and thanking them and expressing gratitude. However, if CBS shows the Jaguars-Texans game, yeah, you're voicing your concerns and making loud complaints. People are way more likely to write reviews and complain when an establishment messes up versus when they do a good job. That's just human nature, and that's the principle applied here with this controversy we're about to dive into the weeds with. But KMOV, for whatever reason, even though the ratings for Cardinals games were incredible, and even though the ratings for other NFL games on average significantly paled in comparison, decided to give in to some extent. Over in Baltimore, which did not have a team at the time and was another one of those free agent markets, the CBS affiliate, WBAL-TV, let fans vote on what games they wanted to see televised, and whatever game got the most votes would be the one that the affiliate would decide to air. One writer suggested that KMOV do the same thing, even though again, all the evidence suggested otherwise, and suggested that KMOV was making the right call showing the Cardinals. Yet, KMOV caved into the vocal minority, and for Week 15 of the NFL season, they were going to let the fans decide on what game the station would air. Let's just say that the vote was an embarrassment. For whatever reason, because of the way the schedule played out, CBS kinda got screwed over with how many games they were set to air that week. Of the 7 games taking place at 12 o'clock, 5 of them were NBC games, meaning that CBS affiliates across the country only had one of 2 games to choose from. Seems hard to believe that today the early time slot would have just 2 possible options, but there was no cross-flexing between networks like there is today, so that's just the way the cookie crumbled, and there was nothing that CBS could do about this. This meant that for Week 15, and for the slate of games on Sunday, December 16th, fans could vote on one of 2 games for KMOV to air at the 12 o'clock time slot. And on paper, the choice seemed pretty obvious. In one corner, you had the Phoenix Cardinals taking on the Dallas Cowboys. In a bizarre twist of fate, this was actually the game being shown to most of the country, and this was one of the most anticipated matchups of the week. The Cowboys entered this game at 6-7, and the Cardinals entered at 5-8. Now, while you might be thinking to yourself that this doesn't sound like a big game, because of how bad the NFC was that year at the bottom, it was huge. The 1990 season was the first non-strike year that the playoffs consisted of 12 teams, meaning that 6 teams in each conference would make the playoffs. And entering Week 15, you had 4 teams, with one of them being the Dallas Cowboys, tied for the number 6 seed with a 6-7 record. This game legitimately had massive implications on the playoff picture. And if the Cardinals won this game, then they would have their best shot in nearly half a decade to make it into the playoffs, and to make it for the first time since moving to Arizona. On top of that, the Cowboys and Cardinals were red hot. Dallas had won each of their last 3 games, including a rather stunning 27-17 victory on Thanksgiving against Washington. I talked about that game in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about that game and how it played out, click the card in the upper right corner. And the Cardinals were also on a 3-game winning streak of their own, having outscored their opponents 78-44 in that 3-game stretch. Plus, whenever the Cardinals and Cowboys played in St. Louis, the attendance was great and the TV ratings were through the roof, especially when compared to every other game. With all those elements in play, this decision seemed like a no-brainer. And it was even more of a no-brainer when you consider the other option that CBS had at their disposal, which was an NFC Central matchup between the Minnesota Vikings and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Much like the Cardinals-Cowboys game, this was a battle between a team at 6-7 and a team at 5-8, with the Vikings having the better record. However, there was no real affiliation to the Vikings or the Buccaneers in St. Louis, and unlike the Cardinals-Cowboys game, where both teams, based off the way they were playing, had a legitimate shot at the playoffs, no one thought that Tampa Bay could make it into the postseason, since they were one of the coldest teams in football. After starting 4-2, they dropped 6 of their next 7 games entering this one. You had Cardinals-Cowboys, a proven ratings winner every year, including earlier in the season when the two teams met in Week 6, and a game featuring 2 red-hot teams with the biggest fan base in St. Louis against the biggest fan base in America, going up against Vikings-Buccaneers, a game that no one outside of those markets really cares about. And KMOV was leaving it up to the fans to decide what matchup was going to be aired in St. Louis at the noon time slot. You're never going to believe what happened next. Which game do you think won the vote? The Cowboys-Cardinals game or the Vikings-Buccaneers game? If you guessed the Cowboys-Cardinals game, congratulations. You're wrong, because the vocal minority who knew that this vote was being conducted stuffed the ballot box. There was no way to limit the number of times that anyone could call in and vote. So theoretically, one person could have called 1,000 times if they wanted to. And sure enough, guess what group rigged the vote to make it so that the Cardinals would not be shown in St. Louis? The crazy part about all this is that there was no internet back then, and there was no way to check on live voting, so KMOV didn't need to do this. They could have put a disclaimer saying that the network reserves the rights to discard the poll results and choose what game they want to air. I can't believe I'm actually suggesting this, but it was okay to lie in this situation. There are some instances where lying for the greater good is the right thing to do. Let's say you get something from a family member for Christmas, but you already have it. Yes, you could tell the truth and say that you have this already, but the right thing to do in this situation is to lie and say that you love it. And considering what the ratings were like for Cardinals games, to go against them to air the Vikings against the Buccaneers, a worse game on paper with no ties to the city, just to appease a very vocal minority, didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Because there's something else we need to talk about here when it comes to people voting on polls. People are either stupid or they will try and be trolls and rig the results to cause the most chaos possible. Don't believe me? That same day that this controversy became public and got national news attention, a Green Bay television station just finished running a poll on who was the greatest coach in the history of the Green Bay Packers. You want to know the guy who won the vote? Lindy Infante. Not Curly Lambeau, the man who the stadium is named after, coached the team for 3 decades and won 6 championships. Not Vince Lombardi, the man who the Super Bowl trophy is named after, won 5 NFL championships, and is widely regarded as the greatest coach in the history of the sport. Nope. Lindy freaking Infante, the guy who never made the playoffs, and in his 3 seasons with the team at the time of this poll, had a record below 500. What does this mean? It didn't mean we renamed the stadium Infante Field. It didn't mean we renamed the trophy the Lindy Infante Trophy. It means that we know that poll results are often not reflective, and are not always meant to be taken seriously on face value. Yet for some reason, KMOV, despite literally all the evidence suggesting otherwise, with the ratings being through the roof for practically every Cardinals game, and with this upcoming game against the Cowboys being arguably the biggest game that the team has had since moving to Arizona, decided that it was a good idea to not bet their poll results and to air the Vikings-Buccaneers game. Naturally, this drew outrage from a ton of people, with one writer saying the thoughts of the then silent majority, which was not so silent after this. Dan Caesar, a writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, said on the move, given the Cardinals-Cowboys history and the Big Red's continued ratings dominance of this market, switching to a game involving teams that have records that are no better than the Cards and Cowboys, and a contest that seems to have minimal local interest, makes little sense other than to appease a noisy group. Jim Rothschild, the programming director for KMOV, basically threw his hands up in the air and said that there was nothing that the network could do. As he said, when we conducted the poll, we made the commitment to live by the vote. Translation, this is stupid, but we can't go back on our word. Just to emphasize how stupid it was, KRCG, the CBS affiliate in Jefferson City, which was in central Missouri about 2 hours west of St. Louis, trashed KMOV for being so stupid, and encouraged people to drive to the city to watch the game. As Lee Gordon, the programming director for KRCG, said on why his station was airing the Cardinals-Cowboys game instead of the Vikings-Buccaneers game, Minnesota-Tampa is really a non-entity game. There is no interest whatsoever in Tampa Bay in this market, so the Cardinals it will be. So just to recap where we are in this entire mess, KMOV, despite having high ratings for every Cardinals game, and despite being the most popular team in St. Louis, decided to air a completely irrelevant game in the market just to appease an incredibly vocal minority that skewed the vote heavily in their favor. That raises one final question on everyone's mind. How did this decision work out? The good news at least was that Cardinals fans in the area were spared from watching an absolute bloodbath. If KMOV showed the Cardinals-Cowboys game, they would have seen their team getting absolutely destroyed, as the Cardinals fell to their division rivals by a final score of 41-10. Emmitt Smith scored 4 touchdowns in this one, with this performance all but clinching him the Offensive Rookie of the Year vote. The Cardinals played so sloppily, turning over 4 times, recording 13 penalties for 137 yards, holding onto the ball for just 23 minutes, picking up just 9 first downs, and picking up just 49 yards rushing on 2.3 yards per carry. And starting quarterback Tim Rosenbach went just 14 for 35, completing 40% of his passes with no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and a passer rating of 17.7, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. The bad news was that the game that was shown on KMOV with the Vikings-Buccaneers game was no better, as the Buccaneers won 26-13 in another game that was not very good. Tampa Bay led it 23-0 at the half, and the Vikings turned it over a whopping 8 times. Vikings starting quarterback Rich Gannon went 2 for 10 with 8 yards passing, no touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating of 0.0. Do you realize how hard it is for a starting quarterback to have a passer rating of 0.0? And unsurprisingly, the ratings for this game on KMOV tanked, because of course they did. Who could have possibly seen that coming? Especially since this game was going up against the Chiefs-Oilers game on NBC, which featured 2 actual good and interesting teams fighting for a playoff spot. So what do we learn from all this? Oftentimes, giving into the vocal minority at the expense of the silent majority, especially when all the evidence suggests otherwise, is stupid. If you have a winning formula that works, there is no reason to change it up, especially when the decision seems to make no sense on the surface. And when you're making decisions as to which game you're going to broadcast, and one option is to air a better game with a big local fan base and a big national fan base, and the other option is to air a worse game with 2 teams that do not have a strong fan base whatsoever in the city, choosing the second option is downright stupid. I know it's not this series, but I'm going to end this one with a line from it, because there's no other way to say it. Talk about a dumb decision. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. If you want to see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.